classic podcast language is that we use this bit before where we're all talking and preparing as the intro, and then now is when it hits the...
This is the British Uplands podcast with Byron Pace and Sarah Roberts. An exploration of change in one of the UK's most important landscapes.
Grant to take down trees, plant to put hedges, grant to take ditches, plants to put on sheep, no grants for sheep come off.
The uplands, they're burning the peat.
If you hear a simple argument put forward about how the uplands need to be managed, then that simple argument has to be wrong.
Definitely going to cut that out of the podcast.
Okay, well, welcome to the British Uplands podcast with Byron Pace and Sarah Roberts.
And producer David Shanks.
Exactly. This is our final episode where we thought we'd finally get together all in one room for the first time since we started this project to try and discuss a little bit about what we've found out. It's been 5 episodes spanning a vast range of very complicated subjects. How many speakers, Byron?
22 or 3, I think.
20 voices. Yeah. And there's been a lot of information. So it's time to talk about it, talk about what we found, and sort it all out, finally.
Finally, and we'll find all the solutions. Your brain was definitely a bit frazzled, Sarah. I remember sitting with you. We stopped at a friend of ours' place when we were on this journey. After 6 days or 7 days of interviewing, you just like interviewing multiple people every day, and I could just see your brain melting.
Information overload. Yeah, I kind of felt like I'd plugged into some sort of other world net, and I needed to get it off my head at one point. I remember actually just taking a strong gin and tonic and sitting out in the garden.
Yes, I do.
Just looking out into space solemnly.
It's all coming back to me now, yeah.
So what I think might be quite helpful just to set out, people have been listening to both of you journeying around the country. So let's find out a little bit about yourselves. Sarah, do you want to kick us off? Just sort of introduce yourself and where are you coming to this from?
Yeah, sure. So my background, I guess, is animal behaviour and storytelling, which kind of led me down the path into environmental journalism. And I have absolutely no background whatsoever with grouse or deer or any of that. So I was kind of coming at this. Probably, I guess, my background, I have much more knowledge in the rewilding side of things and a little in the carbon world, but clearly not that much.
Sharks.
Yeah, a lot on sharks, a bit on grizzly bears, a bit on African wildlife. But yeah, I really didn't know what I was letting myself in for, if I'm honest.
So this was a real journey of learning new things then?
Yeah, it was. I mean, I've always grown up quite well. I lived quite near to the Lake District where I grew up, and there was also the Trough of Bowland just on my doorstep. So I've been in and out of these environments, but mostly using them as like a standard dog walker or hiker, or just going and playing out. But I hadn't realised quite how much there was to maintaining these places.
And Byron, recently, most people who will be familiar with your work will associate it with working in Africa and conservation stories over there. What brought you to do this here then?
So most of the time I spend with a camera in my hand making short documentary films. Like you say, predominantly in Africa, conservation stories there, which are some of the most controversial in the world. But Scotland is home, the Uplands is home more generally. And it is changing at such a rapid rate that I felt like it was something that I really wanted to do at home, actually not be on a plane, traveling so much, and deal with this shifting landscape and really spend the time in the Uplands, a place that I love, drag Sarah in to give that alternative perspective on it, because she's, like she said, her expertise and things that she's dealt with in the environmental circle are so different to mine, and that kind of balance was really important. Likewise, having you as the producer, Davey, in this with your news background, I think was a nice way to bring it to a close and make sure that we were tackling it in a fair and honest way.
So the Uplands.
The Uplands.
One of the most vast, sometimes some would say empty, but clearly not, areas of land in the country. Being so big, means that it is a big lever for change. So when we want to tackle climate change, we look at this space. When we want to plant more trees, when we want to control deer, this is where a lot of these things are. So this is a focal point for a lot of these things. So that's why it comes to this conversation, really. And I think what would be interesting is, I mean, Sarah, from your perspective, over this journey, what did you find that really surprised you then when you started looking into the change that is happening in this landscape?
I guess I was blissfully ignorant for a start that there were so many changes taking place. I knew nothing about I had an idea that we have a lot of deer. I'd heard that rhetoric all around the country, down in Devon and in Lancashire. So that wasn't a surprise. I had sort of in recent years seen a little bit of I guess the first inkling of, tree planting and deer don't really go together. I see here, I'd heard of places buying up areas of land to do tree planting, and I sort of suspected there was an issue, but I had absolutely no real knowledge on peat. I had no real idea about the situation with wind farms, and I also hadn't really considered, I guess, naively, I looked at the uplands as quite a barren landscape, and I'd always had that same rhetoric that I've heard again and again and again since doing this from other people who felt the same. But it was, these are not natural environments. They look like this because of sheep farming, or they look like this because of grouse or something else. And I always just kind of felt like, oh, what a shame. That's how I saw it, and I came to it. I thought, I had that belief that trees and forests were generally better. And now it's kind of shifted on its head, and now I'm a bit more confused
now you
about
don't know.
everything. Now I don't know, yeah. But that's always the way with journalism, isn't it? Especially environmental stuff. You may go in with one idea, but that's the joys of speaking to scientists, is it?
And going in with an open mind, I think, is really key with these things.
I mean, for me, listening to all of this, I mean, the refrain is always, well, it's complicated, isn't it? And there were quite a lot
which
of
we got in episode 1 with Pakeman, which we had that really beautiful line. If you come up with a simple answer about how to manage the uplands, then that simple answer has to be wrong.
Well, that's why that went slap bang into the titles, though. Yeah. But what I thought was interesting is we heard from quite a few people who said that it kind of really depends on what you want, because the uplands historically is a managed environment. It has been created that way. The choices have to be made as to how we proceed with it. What I thought was interesting is when we did the segment on insects, you would expect to say, well, rewild or let things go wild, and that'll be great for insects. But Jana Connolly, the brilliant expert that you spoke to,
yeah, she was great.
About pollinators, said, well, no, because the rapid change could be damaging too.
Because
so
insects can't change that quickly.
Exactly. So the managed environment becomes the environment that is the habitat for some, endangered creatures. Now, so it is the natural thing to say, well, we should preserve. We should, it shouldn't be all about shooting grouse or whatever. But then again, if that is the natural environment that some animals rely on, out with the grouse shooting environment, then what?
Then what do we do? Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, that whole insect section. I wasn't expecting to go there with this journey that we went on, but actually, it was one of my favorite parts of the series.
And of course, again, like you said in your conclusion of the last episode, that change is happening regardless. When Jana was telling us about the pollinators, that climate change itself is bringing new species that don't live in Scotland, don't live in the uplands, and slowly they are edging up.
That way, yeah.
And there are species that are being edged out, who are arriving where they've never been before. So these changes are happening, and that's why it's interesting to be having this conversation now, because we seem to be at a bit of a crossroads.
I think what struck me most is just like how much control humans have in these landscapes, and just as you said, it's like, do you prefer this or do you prefer that? Do you prefer this? And we just seem to have this authority to decide. And I hadn't really taken I just don't think I'd ever fully understood the kind of levels of decisions that we can make when you have such a huge area of land, and then the knock-on effects of that, not just for local people and their economy, but also, like you say, for species that migrate there, or for insects that a keystone that then are going to have a knock-on effect. It just, I understand why a lot of people can't agree on anything.
I think Dr. James Fenton summed it up quite nicely when he said that most of the change in our uplands has been facilitated by the rules and regulations that are implemented by government, and particularly subsidies. Because those subsidies, and this goes to the economics, which was a big part of the conversation in episode 5, is the driver. Whether we like it or not, it would be great to just do things for altruistic purposes, but economics drives change. And so when we saw subsidies, and Dr. Fenton talked about this, with sheep and agriculture back in the 70s and 80s, and also post-World War II, we saw a lot of the draining of the moors, which gets talked about a lot. Draining, reducing water tables, it dries the peat out. It's sort of responsible for a lot of the peatland degradation that Max talked about today, and a lot of the reason for the re-wetting that's happening on. That was a government subsidy for a purpose, for food production, that shaped the landscape, now we know, massively negatively. Same with the flow country. We're seeing government regulation, whether you agree with it or don't agree with it, that is pushing the tree planting in the uplands, but that's being facilitated because it's something that we've decided at a governmental level we want to see happening. Same with the reduction in the deer numbers. So those drivers are what we are living with as we look at that landscape changing. But and it's interesting how often historically that they've ended up really negatively.
But who should steer policy if not,
well, that's the purpose of government, isn't it? Yeah.
One of the interesting things, off the top of my head, I can't remember who brought it up, but one of the interesting things is, yes, steered by grant funding, but to what extent are people watching what is happening in the uplands? So these are not big, controversial populist policies, are they? These are not things that most people in the street are thinking about. Policy affecting the uplands, deer management numbers, cull strategy, things like that. But it affects a lot of the beautiful wildlands of our country. These are not front of the agenda political items, really, are they?
Because it's not affecting people in the urban masses where most
areas,
people live. Yeah.
Until you pulled me into this podcast, I had no idea. On so many of these points that we've covered, I just had no idea that things were happening and such measures. I hadn't got a clue about the government raising the amount of deer that they would like culled each year. I hadn't got a clue about them changing the legislation so that you could shoot males all year round. I didn't realise when it comes to the wind farms, and
yeah, that blew your mind a bit.
That was one of those moments where I just had to sit down and think, wow, we've started. It almost feels like the train has started and it is going so fast down the tracks. There's no alternative routes. Nobody wants to pump the brakes and say, hey, hang on a minute, slow down. Is this the best idea? It's like the velocity and the momentum that we have behind these movements in terms of monetary value, in terms of public perceptions, in terms of global pressures, when you think of the IUCN and this state that we're in, which is, quite a drastic state of change caused by humans, anthropogenic climate change, but it's that problem that you brought up, Byron, about how policy is moving far quicker than science. It's terrifying.
Yeah, and Pakeman brought that up right at the beginning of episode 1, saying that it's frustrating to him and his colleagues that it takes a long time to understand the science of change in the uplands, or not just in the uplands, but anywhere in terms of environmental change. And all they can do is advise. And often it seems the case that the advice that comes from the scientific community isn't necessarily, I hope that it's listened to and evaluated. It doesn't mean that that's the outcome is going to follow the direction that the science is guiding them. And we saw
the
that
science
with...
can't say that something is good. The science can't make a choice.
No.
And the politicians have to look at the options and make a
And weigh
choice.
it.
And science can't do that. So after 5 episodes, Byron, what's the answer? You told us in episode 1 you wanted to find out more about the uplands and the impact
What
of
have I
change.
learned?
So you've been on this adventure. You both have. What's the answer? Come on.
Is it a cop-out to say it's complicated?
Yes.
It is. The thing that's most interesting about listening through these 5 episodes back
Doesn't
to
sound
back,
like he's answering it, Sarah. I don't
I'm
know.
answering it like a politician,
Politician, yeah.
Yep.
is that I was expecting, and I think we were all expecting, more extreme views from the people that we were listening to. But for the most part, everyone came across like they at least wanted to work collaboratively, and they had very level-headed reasons for how they had got to whatever their viewpoint was. And they weren't that far apart as you might have imagined going into this. Like at the extreme ends, I think if you were to ask the average person on the street, the grouse moor owner, so like a D Ward, he has grouse moor as part of the estate that he owns. That might be seen as one extreme end, and then someone like Max at Revive would be seen at the other end. But really, when you listen to them talking, there's a lot of things that they actually had in common, which gives me a lot of hope for being able to come together to a common future or a common vision where actually maybe we can have a bit of everything. But what we see in the media, and I think what we see if you listen to like the committee hearing, the clash of committee hearings in government, is very entrenched views from both sides. Not really the conversations we've just had across these podcasts.
But can everybody win? So if we need green energy and we need wind farms, where are they going to go? As you heard Richard Lindsay in the last episode, he says you need these whaleback hills. He says
beautiful.
You need them, and that could end up being peatland. And he mentioned that the roads are damaging for the peatland. Can everybody win?
I think everybody has to be willing to compromise for some wins. We look at things. We know that wind energy is fantastic and fantastic and green. We know that trees are brilliant. We all know about the Amazon, but it doesn't mean that they're brilliant in all the places, and that's okay. But we seem to be at a time where it's all or nothing on one thing. So it's all trees or it's all wind farms, instead of being able to say, this is a really terrible place to do this, because it makes it complicated. It's a very difficult narrative to get people to understand. It's very easy to say all trees are great. And if that's true in all places, that's a very easy narrative for people to get behind. But if you have to start explaining, well, actually, you've got to pay attention to the peat depth, then you start to lose people. And I think that's unfortunate, and I think that not enough credit. But people are smart. Like, society generally is not dumb. We can cope with these nuances, but that is not what we're used to seeing. We're used to seeing very entrenched polar positions.
Sarah, you did a lot of the interviews that involved sort of tree planting and things like that. How did your perspective change?
For a start, my idea of what a forest should look like is based heavily on forestry, it turns out. So I also had this idealization of lots and lots and lots of mature trees, lots of coverage, that isn't, I've learned what a natural forest would look like. And that was agreed, not just, I thought that would be like the argument against, but actually that was exactly the same as what Trees for Life was saying. It was the same across the board, just as Byron said. There is a lot of agreement across the board. So these small clusters of trees in the right places are good. I hadn't honestly realised quite how much carbon a tree or a sapling releases in the soil, and then also releases if you put it in shallow peat. I had that very idealistic, simplistic view that you plant a tree and then it starts to, take carbon from the atmosphere and put it in its tree trunk, and that's all good. But actually, what was it, 35 years or something? Depending
35
on
to
the
40, yeah.
depending on the tree species before it starts to actually offset carbon.
Well, this was when planted in peatland.
But also depending on the tree species and the soil types,
all trees are not made equal.
Exactly. It's so much more complicated than I thought. And then I don't think I'd quite realised in terms of deer. I knew that they were an issue in saplings, but also I guess when you're trying to manage the numbers of deer and you can't actually easily shoot them in an area that's already forested. You can't find them and hunt them there, but in an open area, it's quite easy. I think this blanket number of this many deer per this area, despite whether that's covered in trees or whether that's moorland, that was difficult for me to get my head around where that decision had come from too.
It is one of those difficult things to get your head around as well. Because I'm obviously not from a background of land management, but when you think about, I love seeing deer when I'm out in the hills and things like that. You see a herd of deer, but you also think, reforestation should be good and things like that. And even rewilding requires a management, an intense management of deer numbers to allow that to happen. And you think, shooting lots of deer, is that good? And instinctively, as someone who loves animals and loves seeing them and things, you think, that's an awful thing. I don't want to see a massive cull of deer. But it's these difficult decisions that have to be made, isn't it? That you kind of have to think of something that is unpleasant to get somewhere else.
I also, I really think that trees are very easy visually for us to get behind and say, yes, they're good. Look at them. That's obvious good thing for the environment. But peat, it's it's below ground, it's muddy, it's gooey,
ugly.
It's ugly. Yeah, it's ugly, and we don't look at mud under our feet and think, oh, what an amazing carbon storage, because we're not taught enough about that, and our mindset for this having an intrinsic value as a great big open space isn't quite there yet. Whereas we go in a forest and there's so many visual mental health benefits that we get just from being around trees that are proven. I don't know, it's like we almost need to do a big PR push for peat as well.
Can I raise something that really hit me in the face that I did not know was a thing at all? The Great Wood of Caledon, right? I know, I can see both of your eyes rolling into the back of your head. Did it exist, Sarah? For me, before, not even a question. But apparently, did it?
I think it existed in the way that a natural forest looked, but not in this big, thick, mature tree, complete blanket coverage that we imagine forests as now.
So just for context, obviously, this is the historical idea that hundreds and hundreds of years ago, perhaps thousands of years ago, Scotland was covered by this Great Wood of Caledon, this historic forest that through the years and through population growth, agriculture, things like that, has been worn down.
Iron smelting.
And no longer exists. And that was, from my mind, what happened. And we obviously see the writings of the Romans and things like that make reference to this great wood and things like that, which may have been an excuse for not getting up there as well. Yeah. And I thought it was it James Fenton?
It was, yeah.
Who basically, in not too polite language, said this is a load of nonsense. It was
Twaddle,
never there. He says there was no evidence for this having existed at all. Well, or for that to have been the reason for that not to exist now. And I thought that was something that made me sit up and go, wait a minute, what? What do you mean?
The Great Wood of Caledon. It sounds grand. But I think I don't know. We speak to experts, and you sift through the information they have, and somewhere between the extremes, there's probably some middle ground, as there often is. And I don't think there was like the enchanted forest that you look at it and it was dark all the way from the borders to the north of Scotland with forestry, because the landscape doesn't lend itself to that.
Well, his argument was that when the glaciers came through, the meltwater washed the nutrients too deep down into the soil for tree roots to establish and grow into large forestry. So therefore, it started to become more barren or
over a period of
treeless,
thousands of years.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it was a really interesting concept. This idea that because we heard this in episode 5, like we should be more like the European tree coverage, but our climate is different. And we had very similar climates to Scandinavia just post the glacial retreat, when it was colder and drier. And then his argument was that, it, like you said, it washed the nutrients through the soil and it became a less palatable substrate for trees to grow in. And when they did grow, they grew much slower, which meant that a deer would come along and they couldn't ever get away. And so that's why we, in part, have the landscape we have today, which is a really, it makes intuitive sense at the very least.
But on the other hand, have we forested? Yes. Have we taken forest land for agriculture?
Absolutely.
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely. Have we changed the landscape? Yes.
Yeah.
So both sides are true.
But that comes back down to the real crux of some of the problems that we have, is that ideally, a lot of the best places, it sounds like, to plant trees would be valuable agriculture land, which we also need.
Said that, yeah.
We also need that to feed the population.
That was a point of consensus, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think pretty much everyone agreed about that. Yeah, if we want to maximize our carbon sequestration, which is the predominant reason for doing that planting, these fields that are around us right now where we're sitting, you'd plant those in trees, but we can't because we have to eat. And this is a trade, and this was the other big takeaway to kind of answer your question from 20 minutes ago to me, is that it doesn't matter what our decision is from the status quo that we have right now. Whatever decision you make as to how that landscape is going to change requires a trade of sorts. I think that was also a consensus. We are trading one thing for another. Whether that's good or bad kind of depends on your point of view and what you want out of that landscape.
It's like, say, Byron, status quo, whatever you want.
Well played.
As you said, going to cut that out of the podcast. Sarah, one of the things that I know that you're looking to investigate even further is the impact of wind farms on peatland. Through the interviews, we found out some startling revelations about that. Tell us, what was it you found out, and why was that so surprising?
Okay, so for me, I was very, very shocked to learn that it's so stupid because it's so obvious as well at the same time, but the penny hadn't dropped. But the idea that every single wind turbine needs this deep road to reach it in order to set that wind turbine up and maintain it. And to put the deep road in, you are then going to alter the flow of water and the hydrology of your peat, which can lead to that drying up, which is very bad news when it comes to all of the carbon that's stored in there. I think for me, it was the combination of that with the muir burn ban, which also I didn't know what muir burn was until I came into
See, that's why you're the right person for this.
Like, muir burn, yeah, cool, Byron. We're going to look at that. What is muir burn? But this whole idea that we are going to not do the managed burns that are being done at the moment means that we may end up with this scraggly, drier, I guess, heather or other grasses or other things that are going to grow there in the peat, okay? That in turn is also drying up the peat bog because it requires more water the larger these plants grow.
And the perspiration as well, in the wind, which I didn't know that either. He was talking about
Yeah. So you couple that with the fact then that you have areas where the wind turbines are, like you say, with the wind, where that area is now drier and hotter than anywhere else. You've then got a bit of a tinderbox growing on top of this area. If you've got less deer as well, you probably get less deer that are going to be eating this.
This is true.
Heather.
I don't think that's a point that's been brought up, but
you've got less things that are managing this situation, and then we have a real issue, a growing issue about wildfires around the world, but obviously it's something that we are conscious about here because it's happened already in Scotland, right? And it happened on my back doorstep near Manchester as well recently, where the Smithills estate was on Saddleworth Hill. Yep. So I think the thing that sort of really blew my mind in this whole scenario was, as we were speaking to estate managers and people that worked up in these areas that were very, very conscious of how they were going to make money, because the price of deer, if you're going to kill that many, that's going down and down and down. And then if you ban the grouse shooting, how are they going to make money? Well, all of these estate managers were getting letter after letter after letter from wind farm and energy suppliers that wanted to put wind turbines on these beautiful whaleback hills, as they say. And it's just, for me, it's like, oh gosh, what's going to happen here? That I think for me was one of the totally mind-blowing positions that I just did not foresee us getting into, especially because I get the need for green energy, but I also have heard, and I'm now busily looking into, is this pattern that we are going to potentially get less wind as well as with climate change. Yeah, it's something the IUCN have mentioned in their studies, and we are seeing some areas that are even more gusty, but others that are having less wind. So yeah, I'm very interested to find out more about that Pandora's box, basically.
I think worth mentioning quickly Muirburn as well. Sarah, you were just discussing that Muirburn. So episode 3 is when we looked into it, because that is such a controversial thing. And I think because it is such a visible signal of moorland management. So from the road, you can see the hills burning. What I thought was interesting is we talk about the new legislation covering it. So there's licensing coming in on Muirburn. So one of the issues against Muirburn is that there is a Muirburn code that says you can't burn on deep peat and things like that. And the argument is, well, we don't know who is doing what. So the licensing tells you, and it provides training. And what I thought was interesting is actually when we spoke to people like Alex Jenkins, a gamekeeper on an estate, he was in favour, wasn't he? I mean, he said broadly.
He said more training is probably better, and a better understanding of what's being burnt where. He didn't seem to have a problem with that. The problems that seemed to come in, if we fast forward to the committee hearing that was in the Scottish Government, actually came from Bruce Farquhar, where he was talking about what he saw as a crucial need for it to continue as a management tool of the uplands. And his main concern isn't about biodiversity. It isn't about anything other than fire management, wildfires. The other elements of that, and whether it sequesters carbon, was the conversation we had with Andreas. But he was, as you're saying, the wildfire is terrifying, Sarah. That was his point of view there, was he thought it would be a massive mistake to take that out of the toolbox of upland management with a view of future wildfires. I mean, he spoke very strongly about it, I felt.
I mean, it's not just a wildfire, though, is it? It's not. And that's
to prevent wildfires.
No. I mean, it's not just a wildfire that's the panic for these uplands. It's the peat. It's this deep, this burn that can go on and on and on under the ground, and it's so difficult to manage, and it's such a large amount of carbon that gets into the atmosphere. But that was the other point within that whole Pandora's box of wind turbines. If we plant more trees in these areas as well, it really is a tinderbox.
It's more biomass to burn.
Yeah.
I mean, there was an argument. I'm not sure whether this actually made the cuts. We brought this up with Alan at Trees for Life, and he made the argument that when you have different types of foliage, it changes the speed with which wildfires move through a landscape, and that gives you time and opportunity to deal with it. That was his argument there. But when we look at what's been happening in Europe, because the fires have been so hot, they've just been running. And there's a very good chance if you read the reports which project our future temperatures, and the way that we have these big high pressure systems like we've had this summer sitting over us for longer periods of time, that's been the pattern. The likelihood is we are going to see, we had the hottest temperatures this year again. We're going to see these an increase in these prolonged periods of time of high temperatures, which means, I think everybody accepts, means that there's a higher risk of wildfires.
Isn't it interesting to look at how different contentious debate issues like Muirburn depend on the sort of length of view you're looking at. So I think when you spoke to Andreas Heinemeyer, who'd done the broadview peatland species, he'd looked at cutting heather, he'd looked at leaving heather to grow wild, and he'd looked at burning heather to look at carbon sequestration and the impact. And kind of, if you burn the heather, of course, it releases loads and loads of carbon. So it's bad. But if you look in a longer view, it's more favourable. And I think that it's really interesting. Sometimes I think we struggle to look at the long term. Yeah,
and I also think that there's a disconnect between each of these different topics. We look at them all as separate things, but they're so interweaved. Just as we said there, you remove the deer, you're going to have problems where you'll have older, drier heather. You don't have the mule burn, you have that. You don't have the income from the deer, and you don't have the income from your grouse moorland. You're probably going to get more wind turbines. It's that interconnectedness, knock-on effects that we just seem to disregard that worries me.
Yeah, time frames is a really important thing, and I brought this up when we got in the first week that we released this podcast with the BBC interview, was that
just Byron getting in that he was on the telly there. Yeah.
Was it good?
Did you get your makeup on television? Byron, yeah.
Anyway,
we didn't know.
Says the guy who was on TV all week this week.
I didn't want to mention that. I don't like to mention it.
A lot of the decisions, by virtue of the fact of our political system, politicians get voted in every 4 to 5 years. And so whether we like it or not, a lot of decision-making and the benefits of that decision-making is often viewed like within that framework of a period of time. But conservation and environmental decision-making can't possibly be that short, because we know from, I think, every single scientist we spoke to that you need to take longer. It's essential. It's critical if we want to improve biodiversity, if we want to improve the way that we live and manage the landscapes for the betterment both of people and for wildlife, that we need to take a long-term view. But to take a 10, 20, 30-year view, the politicians who are there now are not going to be in their seats in 30 years' time. So how do we create a system where we can all sit round a table and say politics doesn't matter here? What matters is the good of the landscape, the good of nature, the good of the ecosystems, and how people can benefit from it. And it needs to be beyond party lines. And we haven't got there yet. We absolutely haven't got there yet.
The trouble is, though, if people don't see any immediate results, if they're not even going to see results within their lifetime, you've got everybody just putting so much trust into something. That's a big ask, especially landowners as well. It's a huge ask as well. If you're saying, we're going to take away these levels of income from you, but trust us, in the long run, you'll thank us for it.
Well, there's that really beautiful quote, which is that societies grow great when people plant trees under which they will never sit. And there's something really, and we used to see that. You go to those beautiful gardens that people love to go and visit in the summer with those ancient old oak trees that were planted 1,000 years ago. The people who planted those were long dead before that was a magnificent tree, and yet we covet them today. And
what did the peat survey say for where they were planted?
Well, these aren't on peat. These are all in lower ground because oak trees don't really grow out there. But that long-term view is something we've definitely, I think, lost because, and we live in a society of immediacy.
It also comes back down to that connection for me.
Of nature?
Yeah, connection to real nature. Not an idealistic perspective of like I went for a walk or I spent 3 days in a lovely place, which is great. But like we need somehow to integrate the nuances and the trickiness and the realities of nature into our education system. It needs to be there. People need to understand it from a child upwards for us to appreciate it. Not just like the benefits of it, but just how, the balancing act of nature. I just don't feel that a lot of people that have very strong opinions on either direction necessarily always have the strongest overview.
And we kind of saw that with the videos because we've been releasing these short little snippets of these interviews. Well, that's your dog lapping up water in the background. And we needed to have a dog in every episode, which I think we've now achieved. These what are they? 60 to 90 second snippets from these interviews of you interviewing people, Sarah. And when you look at the comments that people have been commenting on, it's amazing how like emotionally, sometimes almost angry people respond to these tiny little snippets of either opinion or viewpoint. And then when you ask, well, hang on, and it says at the end, listen to the whole podcast. At the end of every single one of these, have you actually listened to the episode, which is 25 plus minutes long, where you can get much more of the nuance? You can't get nuance in 90 seconds, but you need a hook to get people to listen to it. And I'm not sure if anybody ever said that they did listen to it, or they hadn't at the point where they commented.
Some people have gone away and listened and come back, and then come back with more feedback and
really?
been like, yep, they really enjoyed it, or they're glad to hear that there's going to be more on this topic or the next one's on that topic. The odd person, I guess, that feels very strongly has said, well, I'm outright not going to listen to it because I've just heard this 15 seconds and I don't agree with that point of view.
So silly.
But that's, that does not help us because... Oh, sorry, he's having a good shake over there. It's Yamba in the background. But no, that narrow-mindedness and that unwillingness to bend and compromise in the grander scheme of things is really what's holding up conservation, important integral conservation, not just here. This is just a small case study for me, the Uplands, and for you, Byron, and probably for you too, Davey, but this is being repeated, rinsed and repeated all around the world. There just seems to be too many egos involved.
Right. The most important thing to discuss, Byron, a refrain throughout this podcast has been you greeting dogs.
Hello, I see you.
As the person who has edited each and every one of these podcasts lovingly.
The problem is that I'm sitting here. We're sitting here, and Sarah's dog is in the room. But if I am excluding episode
present
6,
company
present company excluded, I feel like when we met Kathy, because she had a couple of dogs, and I think you probably got the most emotion in my voice as to when when we met those dogs there. I was talking to the dog like it was a small child.
It was a young one as well, wasn't
it? It was a pup.
Yeah.
Clearly your favourite bits. Sarah got to get involved with the food side of things.
Well, she absolutely loved that.
Which was, that was a bit of a jolly, wasn't it, Sarah? Really?
It wasn't really a work day, that one.
That, though, was actually another piece of information that totally blew my mind.
A fascinating interview. It really was.
Tim's
amazing.
Yeah, Tim Adams, the chef and broadcaster as well, who was giving you a lovely venison meal, wasn't he?
He made such a valid point, which was, we have a situation right now going on where bills are higher than ever, the cost of living is higher than ever, but we have this amazing, healthy food option, which the government's now, suggesting that we're going to have more and more of. Why are we not marketing venison better? Why are we not using that in schools or in other places? It's still seen as this luxury product, but actually when we went to the game dealers, they were swamped in venison. They had more than they could ship. And the price is declining because the market's flooded. So that was another thing where we just really need to change our mindsets, because it would be a crying shame to me if that meat was wasted.
It's not cheap in the shops, though, is it?
No, it's so expensive.
And that was the thing that we couldn't quite understand, because you asked this question when we were at the game dealer, Sarah. So I don't understand. So where's the value add? Why is it so expensive for me to buy it in the shops?
So for anyone listening, obviously episodes 4 and 5, so 4 when we focused on animals, and 5 is when you're going to hear a bit more deer. 5 is when... Sarah, you're interviewing in a game dealership as well, hearing a bit more about the business.
Yeah, Art Guy came up and
exactly, and about how they're struggling right now, and where is all this meat going, and why can't we buy it for cheap? It's a very interesting question that we haven't admittedly been able to get to the bottom of.
It's like wonky veg, right? Mm-hmm. Because they can't say for definite how old that deer is, and it's all of the constrictions of supermarkets, but then it's also a mindset of the public, because I still know lots of people that have never eaten venison, or maybe
I fed you venison last night.
I know, and it's delicious. For somebody that eats meat, I would say it's delicious.
And that's episode 2, isn't it, with Tim Adams? We can go back and listen to if you want to hear Sarah's interview, because it is really interesting.
And her tasting the great food at the end.
But for me, from like a welfare perspective, if these animals are being taken out the system anyway, and they've had a rich natural life, And we know that that is done in a sustainable method and in a very humane way. In many respects, for me, this is far better than some of our alternatives, and it avoids it being wasted. So it's a no-brainer, but it doesn't seem to be happening yet.
So I think it just contains so many more variables than other food, though.
Does,
and I think that comes back to what you were saying about connection to our food, connection to our uplands and our wild land, is that obviously it's not a pre-packaged meat. You can't guarantee, like you can with factory farming, that this animal has lived 50 days under these exact conditions, and that's the meat you're being given. This
and it's
animal,
only eaten this or it's only eaten that.
which is a completely other conversation about how you reflect upon that. But, this is an unusual, it's lived a life. It's,
I think what's a real shame is that we could, with a different frame on this, view it as a great success story. Here in the uplands, we have this amazing resource that we can feed humans with. And it should exist in this landscape. That should be a success story. Yes, you can argue in some places there's too many. In some places you can argue that there's maybe not enough. And we need to balance it with our desire to plant trees in place. And how do we do that? Is it with fencing? Is it with reduction culls?
natural predators.
Natural predators, is another argument.
Yeah.
Some people would agree and disagree with whether that would actually make an impact on the deer populations to the extent to which we need.
We heard very briefly from Pete Cairns
we did, very
about
briefly.
that episode 4.
That might be a whole other podcast.
Yes, I
that's
know.
a Pandora's box.
He talked about not wanting to be the wolfman of the Highlands.
Exactly.
But,
which was smart, because it's something that has been kind of overdone. And to his point, it's a ground up approach, rewilding.
Charismatic megafauna.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it should be an amazing success story. Like, we have this great resource. How wonderful is that we can feed people with a wild resource sustainably? Unfortunately, that was one thing that did come up when we were at the Game Dealer, is with the increase that is starting to come through, that level isn't sustainable. So they're having to deal with this big influx and increase in culls, and all of the staff and processing to be able to deal with this extra volume. But that's not going to last forever, because the whole point behind the increased culls is to get a lot of deer through the food chain and off the hills to help tree regeneration.
So these are new rules.
These are new rules.
Just for context, that allow land managers to cull male deer across a longer period of the year, use specialist scopes, night sights, so they can cull them at night, so increasing the amount of time that you have as well. And there's new ammunition as well, so there won't be as much lead shot used as well. Yeah. So these are the new things coming through that are really affecting how game dealerships and this deer stalking is done.
I brought this up in episode 5, but what's interesting about the male deer season being opened is that populations aren't controlled by controlling the males at all. It's all with the female population. So deer management historically has, and if you go to most of the estates around here, the vast majority of deer that they cull for deer management to keep the population, because it's in their interest as well that they don't overgraze an area with the males, has been predominantly through shooting females during the hind season. So shooting the males isn't going to make that much difference, and that's
does that
kind
not
of population.
Forgive my ignorance, but does that not just reduce the number?
It would reduce the overall number, but it's not a population control measure, because they're not the ones dropping
the
calves.
population, though.
Yeah, but that's not how you control. If you want to reduce populations, you have to reduce the breeding part of the population, because one male, particularly with red deer, one male is going to service 25 females in a harem. So you don't need all of those extra males. The actual dropping of calves in the season in May is done by females. So population control measures are not done by reducing male population.
This is where the argument comes in that you're actually affecting the genetics variability, aren't you? If you take a load of males out, and it is usually one male that's going to populate an area, of females, if you're taking a lot of those males that would naturally compete against each other, and the strongest ones survive, what's the knock-on effect?
Well, I'm not sure how much selectivity is going to be going on, because that's something that has been very common practice, historic with tradition, is selectivity of the animals being taken out for the health of the herds. But I'm not sure how much selectivity is going to be going on with the rapid increase in contractors being paid per head to get it through the food chain. It's a whole other discussion. But
I was going to say, but is the scale of the population cull? I mean, it's quite an unpleasant thing to think about, but is it so large that perhaps they do need to think differently about how they do it?
About how they actually do it?
Yeah, I mean, does there need to be such a drastic reduction in numbers that these traditional methods that you're discussing and thinking about, the way that it's been done before, that perhaps, as unpalatable as it is to think about, if we are to reform the uplands and have a different way of doing things, if you're going to rewild, if you're going to reforest, all of these things, that unfortunately does there have to be a drastic drop? We mentioned deer in almost every episode.
We did. Yeah, I think one of the interesting parts of that, of the conversation at the game dealers, and this makes perfect sense if you think about it, is him talking about how, and in reference to extending the male deer season, is that during the rut, that sort of 1 month during the rut, it's the worst meat to eat because they're not really eating very much. So they're losing a lot of condition. It becomes quite tainted because they're full of hormones.
I thought that was extraordinary.
It's really fascinating.
30% of the game he is dealing, he says he personally wouldn't eat.
Because of the taste of it. Now, what we used to do is we used to export that. So it was never wasted. It was exported to Europe pre-Brexit. Now it's very difficult to export. So now there isn't really a great market because we don't have a taste for that much stronger meat here. It was made into a lot of sausages in Europe. So by changing the season and removing the burden of shooting most of those males during the rut where they're the worst condition that they are in the entire year, that makes great sense. So to your point, does there need to be change? That seems like a sensible thing to do, because why do you want to put meat into the food chain that's not great to eat?
It's incredibly unpopular. Mass culling.
It is very unpopular.
You just reminded me of something else that we learnt at the game dealers as well, because it wasn't just that they can't export the meat anymore, but he also said that he used to export the skins, because I remember there were so many products. I was like, I wanted to see where everything went, and there were so many parts where I was like, oh, does this go for pet food? No, because the regulations have got really, really tight on that. So this now goes in the bin. Oh, okay. What about the skins? Where do they go? Well, we used to export them to China, but actually now we can't because of our dealer and the regulations, and now that doesn't happen. So the wastage is still there as well. It's like there's such
makes great leather as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Really
there's
leather.
such a large amount of material there that really it would be good if somebody just jumped on it and made use. If we are going to take these animals out the food chain, can we use them for something? If you're gonna, the idea of binning it, I think, made it even harsher.
Absolutely. Well, it feels like, our conversation about the uplands is coming to an end after so many months of doing
Sadly,
that.
or relief, one of the two.
But now I suppose the conversation has to continue, and I hope people who've listened to it will have at least had a few things that have made them think, or think differently, or think again. Sarah, what would you hope that people who've listened through this series would take away from what they've heard?
I would really hope that they maybe came into it with just for the people like me that came into it maybe with less knowledge, left with more knowledge. That's all I hope, really, is that, like, minds will have been opened, and that there is a consistent overlap of viewpoints where there is a happy medium in all of these extreme points of view. Although they're, from the outset sounding really extreme, when we spoke to all these different people, it seemed that there was an overlapping area where we might be able to move forward and keep most people happy. Seemed that way anyway. What do you think, Byron?
It did seem that way. It would just be great if the kind of discussions that we've had on the podcast happened more broadly.
It would be great if you could get all those people in one room.
In the same room,
yeah.
And I'm sure everybody would probably get on.
What do you think for you, Byron, is the main takeaway from these episodes that we've done?
Go into discussions with an open mind as you can. Try and be aware of where because we all have our own biases from however we were brought up or the things that you're involved in, which are quite difficult to get past, but at least be aware of them and acknowledge them and kind of own them, so that you can try and understand where other people are coming from. and be willing to have those discussions, and be willing to hear things that you don't want to hear.
Yeah. And just because you don't like it,
just because you don't like it, because I think we have a tendency to say, well, I don't like their point of view, so I'm not even going to listen to how they got to that. But then when you actually sit down and you have a conversation with somebody, whether it's something you believed in or not to begin with, to your point, you realize that there's a lot of crossover. So I think the more that we can do that, the more chance that we have of creating a future that's good for everyone. I don't think it needs to be an all or nothing. I think that we can all have a bit, and we're all going to have to compromise, and it's always going to be a trade. There'll be some winners and there'll be some losers, but we need to try and find what that terrible word balance is.
I think for me, it's that this is important.
It is
that this matters, that this is not the preserve of hunting, shooting, fishing people. What happens in the uplands affects you in your house in Brecon or Falkirk or Edinburgh too, because this is, or Lancashire, exactly. Because this is our path to net zero. This is carbon sequestration. This is where your power lines are going, where your power is coming from, your clean water, the wildfire on your doorstep. All of this matters immensely and is not a discussion for somebody else. It's a discussion for you at home. And I think that's what's really stuck out to me, is just how much this translates,
I agree. I think that's a brilliant way to wrap this up. Well, thank you, Davey, for going through all of these million interviews, finding a way to stitch it together that was entertaining for people to listen to, and to you, Sarah, for putting up with me on a road trip as we were going through and speaking to these different experts and peoples with opinions in the uplands. It's been a lot of work putting this together, but it's also been brilliant. It's the kind of podcast series and journalism and investigation on a topic that I'd like to do more of.
And of course, thank you everyone at home who has listened to all of these episodes and joined us on the journey through the uplands and commented and questioned and gave us great feedback on everything we've been trying to do, which has really steered us along the way. Thanks very much for listening and spending all this time with us.
If you would like to contact us, ask us a question, or find out more, head over to www.thebritishuplands.com.
The British Upland series is presented by Byron Pace and Sarah Roberts, co-produced and edited by David Shanks as part of the Into the Wilderness podcast, an MH Studios production.